My sister dumped her 2 toddlers on my porch and casually announced she wouldn't be back until my niece turned 18, so I made sure she learned exactly what consequences really meant. The doorbell rang 4 times before I got my shoes on. I opened the door and found my sister Brooke standing on my porch with 2 rolling suitcases beside her. My niece Nora was gripping a stuffed rabbit. My nephew Finn was asleep against her hip. Brooke was already backing toward her car. "You're home." "Good," she said. "You're 34. No kids. Big house. These 2 need stability. I'll swing by when Nora turns 18. I laughed because I thought it was a joke. Nobody says something like that and means it. Then Finn stirred and Brooke set him down on the porch mat next to his suitcase, the way you'd drop off dry cleaning. "I already told them you're their new daddy now," she said. "I need to focus on my music without distractions. Kids don't belong in a studio." "Brooke, you can't just leave your own children on a porch." She was already halfway into her car. "Sure I can. You're their uncle. Besides, you owe me for that summer after college. That was 10 years ago. I paid your rent that whole summer, Brooke, and I'm cashing that in," she said, like it was a coupon with an expiration date that just happened to be her children's childhood. Nora looked up at me. 4 years old, still holding that rabbit by one ear, not crying yet, just watching her mother the way kids watch things they've learned not to trust. Finn was still half asleep. He didn't understand what was happening. Nora did. I could see it on her face, that particular stillness kids get when they've already learned that panicking doesn't change the outcome. "Brooke, get back here." She was in the driver's seat. The window was still down. "They've got clothes for a week. Nora knows her allergies. Finn still naps at 1. You can't do this. Watch me." I remember the exact sound her tires made pulling off my curb, that specific chirp against warm asphalt, because I've replayed it more times than I can count. She didn't look back. Nora did. Nora watched the car until it turned onto Cleveland Avenue and disappeared, and then she looked at me, and then she looked at Finn, and then she sat down on the porch step next to her suitcase and waited like she'd done this kind of waiting before. For a second, standing on my own porch with the engine noise fading down the block, I genuinely didn't know what my body was supposed to do next. Finn had started crying again, that thin, exhausted wail of a toddler who'd been fighting sleep in a car seat for who knows how long before any of this. Nora just stood there next to her suitcase, watching me with an expression that had no business belonging to a 4-year-old, patient, and unsurprised, like she'd already run this exact scenario in her head before it happened and was simply waiting to see which version of it she was going to get. I carried both suitcases inside because I didn't know what else to do. You don't leave 2 toddlers on a porch while you stand there deciding how you feel about it. Finn woke up fully once we were in the kitchen and started crying for his mother. The kind of crying that doesn't stop when you pick a kid up, that just changes shape in your arms. Nora didn't cry. She sat at my kitchen table and asked if she could have crackers, and I gave her the whole sleeve because I didn't know what a 4-year-old was supposed to eat and I didn't have anything else that seemed safe. I called Brooke 15 times over the next 2 hours, straight to voicemail every time. I texted her the word "call me" 9 times. On the 10th, she finally answered, not with a call, with one line: "Stop being selfish. They need you." That's the moment I stopped being frantic. I want to be honest about that because it's the part of this story people don't expect. I didn't spiral. I didn't scream into a pillow. Something in me just went quiet and cold and very, very clear, the way water gets right before it freezes. I looked at those 2 suitcases sitting by my front door, and I noticed something I hadn't clocked in the panic of the moment. They weren't packed for a week. Nora's suitcase had winter coats folded into it, and it was July. Finn's had a folder zipped into the side pocket that turned out to be his immunization records and both kids' birth certificates. Somebody packs a week's trip with a swimsuit and some socks. Somebody packs a lifetime with paperwork. I didn't say anything about it out loud that night. I just filed it away, the way you file away a smell that doesn't match the room. It would matter later. At the time, all I knew was that I had 2 children I hadn't asked for, a sister who'd gone dark, and a decision to make about what happened next. I made a different call instead. Brooke's husband, Gavin, had moved out of their apartment 6 months earlier, and even though the marriage was over, he and I had stayed close. I found his number and called him at 9 that night, Nora already asleep in my guest room in a nest of couch cushions, Finn finally down after I'd bounced him around my kitchen for 45 minutes, singing whatever half-remembered songs I could pull out of my head. "She did what?" Gavin said, and I could hear him sit down hard on something, a chair or a bed, the sound of a man's legs giving out under him. I told him everything: the porch, the suitcases, the line about turning 18, the winter coats packed in July. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, in a voice I'd never heard him use before, low and completely certain, he said, "Bring them here. My parents have been dying to have their grandkids." I looked at those 2 sleeping kids in my house, kids who 2 hours earlier hadn't been my responsibility, and I understood that whatever came next was going to change all of our lives. I just didn't know yet how far it would go, or how much of it Brooke had already planned before she ever rang my doorbell. To understand how we got to that porch, you have to go back further than that night. You have to understand who Brooke actually was. Not the version of her I'd spent 30 years defending to everyone else, but the real one. The one whose patterns I'd been ignoring for a decade because she was my little sister, and ignoring them was easier than admitting what I I was looking at. I'm Marcus. I was 34 that summer, a senior software architect for a healthcare technology company based out of Columbus, working remotely from a 4-bedroom house in Westerville I'd bought 3 years earlier after a promotion I'd worked myself half to death for. No kids of my own, not by tragedy, just by a life that had gone in a different direction. I dated occasionally. I worked a lot. I liked my quiet house and my quiet routines, and I had never once imagined that routine ending with 2 toddlers asleep under my roof on a Tuesday night. Brooke was 31, 3 years younger than me, and for as long as I could remember, she'd been the creative one in the family. The label our mother, Carol, had given her around age 9 and never once revisited. Our parents split up when Brooke was 11 and I was 14. Our father, Dennis, moved to Cincinnati for a job and slowly faded into birthday cards and the occasional stilted phone call. Carol raised us in Newark, Ohio, on a school nurse's salary, and somewhere in that arrangement, Brooke learned that being talented was a kind of currency and that other people's obligation to support her talent didn't have an expiration date. She was genuinely gifted. I want to be fair about that. She had a voice that could stop a room, and she'd been writing songs since she was 13. But talent and follow-through are different animals, and Brooke had one and treated the other as optional. She dropped out of a music program at Ohio University after 2 semesters because, in her words, professors were trying to make her sound like everyone else. She waited tables. She quit waiting tables. She started a band, quit the band, started another one. She married Gavin when she was 24 and he was 26, and for a while it looked like it might steady her. Gavin was an electrician, IBW Local 683 out of Columbus. Steady hours, steady paycheck, the kind of guy who showed up on time and meant what he said. Nora was born when Brooke was 27. Finn came 2 years later. Gavin picked up double shifts to cover the gap between what he made and what Brooke's music never quite brought in, working 60, sometimes 70 hours a week, while Brooke chased studio time with a band called Neon Static that had, in 4 years, made a little over $600. The earlier incident I should have paid more attention to happened about 18 months before the Porch. Finn was still an infant, maybe 6 months old, and Nora was 2.5. Brooke asked our mother to take the kids for the weekend so she could get, in her words, a little breathing room. Carol agreed, because Carol always agreed. The weekend turned into 11 days. Brooke had driven to Nashville for a songwriting retreat she'd found on social media, a paid workshop that cost $400 she didn't have, and she simply didn't come back on schedule. She texted Carol updates every few days, always some version of almost done, just one more session, and Carol, watching 2 small children by herself in her 60s with a bad hip, never once said the thing that needed saying, which was that Brooke had lied about how long she'd be gone because she knew the truth would have gotten a no. I remember calling Brooke on day 9 of that trip, annoyed on our mother's behalf, and Brooke telling me I didn't understand what it was like to have something inside you that needed to get out. I told her mom needed a break too. She told me I'd never had kids, so I didn't get to have an opinion. I let it go. That's the piece I keep coming back to. I let it go, the same way I'd let go of the 10 years of small loans that were never repaid, the couch surfing that turned into month-long stays, the pattern that had been building the entire time I'd been looking away from it, telling myself she was just going through something, telling myself family doesn't keep score. The rent I mentioned on the porch, the thing she said I owed her for, happened the summer after I graduated college. I was 24. Brooke was 21, between apartments, and asked if I could cover her rent for what she swore would be 2 months, while she got a security deposit back from a landlord who was slow walking her. 2 months turned into 6. I paid $700 a month into an account I never saw again, $4,200 total, money I'd saved from my first real job, gone by September with no plan for repayment, and no real conversation about it either. When I finally asked about it that fall, Brooke told me I was being weird about money and that she thought we were past keeping track of things like that. We were never past it. She was just the only one keeping score, and the score only ever ran in one direction. I want to be honest about my own part in that too, because it's easy to tell this story like I was simply a bystander who finally got fed up. I wasn't. At Gavin and Brooke's wedding, 6 years before the Porch, Brooke asked me the morning of the ceremony to quietly cover the difference on a catering bill she'd underestimated by nearly $2,000. And rather than have a hard conversation with her on her own wedding day, I wired the money before the reception started and never mentioned it again. Not to her, not to Gavin, not even really to myself. That was the pattern I was inside of for a decade, not blind to it exactly. More like fluent in it, so practiced at absorbing the cost quietly that I'd stopped registering it as a cost at all. I think that's part of why the Porch worked on me for as long as it did before I got calm and cold about it. Some old, well-worn part of me was still waiting for the moment where I'd just quietly handle it, the way I always had, and it took 2 suitcases packed with a decade's worth of paperwork to finally short-circuit that reflex for good. That was the relationship before it broke. Not a single dramatic betrayal, but a decade of small ones, each one small enough on its own to swallow, each one training me to expect the next. I loved my sister. I want that on the record too. I loved the version of her that used to sing to me through the wall we shared as kids, the version who cried at our grandmother's funeral when she was 12 and sang Amazing Grace a cappella umbrella at the graveside because nobody else could get through it. That person was in there somewhere. But by the time she stood on my porch with 2 suitcases and a countdown to my niece's 18th birthday, I had spent 10 years learning that Brooke's love for the people around her was real, right up until it cost her something she didn't want to pay. The morning after the porch, I called Brooke 15 more times before 9 a.m. Nothing. I sent one more text, just 2 words. We need to talk about the kids. Her reply came an hour later. Stop being dramatic. You've always wanted to play the hero. Now you get to. I read that message 3 times, standing in my kitchen while Nora ate cereal with a spoon 2 sizes too big for her hand, and I understood something about my sister I'd never let myself say out loud before. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was annoyed that I was making her situation inconvenient by not just quietly absorbing it. That single text told me more than the porch had. A woman in crisis begs. A woman who thinks she's found a loophole gets irritated when the loophole complains. I called Gavin back that morning and told him I wanted to bring the kids to his parents that day, not next week, not after I'd figured things out. He agreed instantly. I packed the 2 suitcases Brooke had left, added a bag of my own groceries because Nora had told me, very matter-of-factly, that they didn't really have snacks at home anymore, and drove the 40 minutes to Pickerington, where Gavin's parents, Harold and Diane, lived in a brick 2-story with a swing set already standing in the backyard. Harold met us in the driveway and scooped Finn up before I'd even gotten the car door fully open, saying his name like it was something he'd been saving. Diane took Nora by the hand and walked her inside to a bedroom that already had a dresser full of clothes and a shelf of toys, kept ready, I realized, for exactly a moment like this one, because grandparents who've been shut out for months tend to prepare for the day the door opens again. Gavin stood in the driveway with me for a second before either of us said anything. She's about to learn what consequences are, he said finally. That night, the kids slept through without waking once. No crying, no nightmares, nothing. Diane told me the next morning that she'd checked on them twice out of habit and found them both sleeping like the house itself was quieter than anything they'd known in a long time. It hit me hard hearing that. These kids had been stressed for longer than I'd understood, and none of us had known, because Brooke had built a life that looked from the outside and even from close up like an overwhelmed young mother doing her best. It took a porch and 2 packed suitcases to show the rest of us what her best had actually cost. I called Brooke that evening to tell her where the kids were, mostly because I didn't want her showing up unannounced somewhere and making a scene in front of Harold and Diane. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting to hear from me. You kidnapped my kids, she said, before I'd even gotten a full sentence out. I'm calling the police. You're the one who dropped them on my porch and drove off, Brooke. I didn't kidnap anyone. I made sure they were safe. I just needed a little help. You're twisting this. How long is a little help, Brooke? Give me a real number. Silence. Actual, dead silence. The kind that answers a question louder than words would. She didn't have a number because there wasn't one. There was just an open-ended absence she'd never planned on filling, dressed up in the language of a woman asking for a favor. She followed through on the threat 2 hours later. A patrol car showed up at Harold and Diane's door, and I drove back over so I'd be there when it happened. The officer, a heavyset guy in his 50s named Deputy Ransom, sat all of us down in Harold's living room and asked to see the texts. I showed him everything. Brooke's message about turning 18, the stop being selfish text, the stop being dramatic text. He read through it twice, shook his head slowly, and picked up his own phone right there in front of us and called Brooke directly. I only heard his half of it, but I didn't need the other half. Ma'am, I've seen the messages. No, that's not how abandonment works. You should be ashamed of yourself. He hung up without waiting for a response and told us there was nothing here that constituted a crime on our end, and that if anyone should be worried about police involvement, it wasn't the family who'd taken 2 toddlers off a porch and gotten them fed, bathed, and asleep in a safe house within hours. Gavin's lawyer, a family law attorney named Regina Castellano, got involved by the end of that week. She moved fast. She told Gavin the porch drop-off, combined with the 11-day Nashville disappearance from 18 months earlier, gave them a real abandonment argument under Ohio law, and she wanted documentation on everything, going back years if we had it. Gavin started pulling old texts. I started writing down every loan, every unreturned favor, every date I could remember, and handing my notes over to Regina like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was preparing for my whole life. Regina also told Gavin to get the kids into a pediatrician immediately, both for their well-being and because a documented medical picture would matter if this went in front of a judge. The appointment was 2 days later with a pediatrician named Dr. Anissa Farrow in Pickerington. Finn was 6 months overdue on his vaccination schedule, missing 2 rounds that should have happened months earlier. Nora had a cavity that Dr. Farrow said had clearly been rotting untreated for a while, months at minimum, the kind of thing that gets caught early with a single dentist visit a responsible parent's schedules without thinking twice about it. Nora had also lost weight since her last recorded checkup. Not dramatically, but enough that Dr. Farrow flagged it in her notes without us even asking her to. Every piece of that went into a file that kept growing. Regina called it more than once the kind of file that builds itself if you just keep asking the right questions. questions. Brooke didn't go quiet after the police call. She went public instead. 4 days after the porch, she posted on Facebook a long paragraph about how her family had betrayed her, how her own brother and estranged husband had teamed up to steal her children while she was trying to build a career for their future, how she'd never imagined the people she trusted most would do something so cruel. It got 40-some comments within an hour, most of them supportive, because none of those people had seen the texts, the suitcases packed with winter coats in July, or the 11 days in Nashville. Gavin, who is not a naturally confrontational person, surprised me. Within an hour of Brooke's post, he'd put up his own, screenshots included. Brooke's message asking him for $380 for a new guitar pedal 2 weeks before the porch, sent the same week Nora needed shoes that fit, and Finn needed diapers Gavin had been quietly covering out of his own paycheck. He didn't editorialize much. He just posted the receipts and let people draw their own conclusions, and people did, quickly and without much mercy. That's when the messages started coming to me. Old classmates, people Brooke had gone to high school with, people from the various bands and open mic circuits she'd cycled through over the years, all reaching out within about 48 hours of each other like a dam breaking. A woman named Priya, who'd roomed with Brooke for 4 months in her early 20s, told me Brooke had left in the middle of the night 3 days before rent was due, taking the good pots and pans with her and leaving Priya to cover the full amount alone. A guy named Colin, one of the founding members of an earlier band Brooke had been in, told me she'd borrowed $900 for studio time and never paid a cent of it back, then unfollowed him on everything when he asked about it. Every story had the same shape. Brooke framed the taking as a temporary and reasonable request, and then treated any attempt to collect or even discuss it as a betrayal of some unspoken bond she alone had decided existed. I'd lived that exact pattern for a decade, and somehow needed 5 strangers to describe it back to me in almost identical language before I let myself see it clearly. Brooke's next move came through her attorney rather than directly, a motion asking the court to delay the abandonment hearing by 60 days, citing a new diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder and a prescribed course of treatment that made her, in the filing's language, not presently able to participate meaningfully in adversarial proceedings. Regina didn't fight the diagnosis itself, only the timeline, pointing out that the same week the motion was filed, Brooke had posted publicly about attending a 3-day music conference in Cleveland, driving 4 hours round trip and staying out past midnight both nights, activities the court might reasonably weigh against a claim of being too impaired to sit in a hearing. The judge assigned to the motion granted a short 2-week extension and nothing more, noting in his order that he expected all parties, including Brooke, to use the time productively rather than as further delay. I don't doubt Brooke was anxious. I think she probably was, genuinely, in whatever way a person is anxious when consequences are finally catching up to a life built on outrunning them. What I couldn't get past was watching her reach for that anxiety as a tool the same practiced way she'd once reached for a rent check she never intended to repay, using a real and difficult thing about herself as leverage in a fight she was otherwise losing on the facts. Gavin told me once, flatly, that he almost respected how consistent she was. Every single lever she pulled, money, guilt, family loyalty, now her own health, got pulled the same way, aimed outward, in service of buying herself more time and less accountability. Never once in service of the 2 kids the whole proceeding was actually about. Regina used the custody proceedings standard framework to get supervised visitations scheduled for Brooke, twice a week, an hour each session, at a family services office in Reynoldsburg, with a court-appointed monitor present. It was meant to give Brooke a structured, low-stakes way to show she was serious about her kids. She showed up 40 minutes late to the first one, blaming traffic that, according to the monitor's notes, didn't match any actual incident reported that day. She spent most of the second session on her phone, texting, only occasionally looking up to ask Nora a question and not waiting long enough to hear the full answer before looking back down. She skipped the third session entirely, texting the monitor 40 minutes before it started that weekends were her prime creative time and she'd need to reschedule. Each of those failures should have been the bottom. Each time, I thought, surely now she understands what's at stake. Surely this is the wake-up call. And each time, Brooke found a way to prove there was another floor beneath the one I thought we'd hit. That's the part about a person like my sister that took me the longest to learn. The ceiling you think you found isn't a ceiling at all. It's just wherever your imagination stopped being willing to go, and Brooke had never had that particular limitation. Brooke tried one more angle before the discovery request went anywhere, and it was the one that actually got under my skin the most. She had our Aunt Denise, Carol's older sister, start calling around the family asking people to check in on my motives, planting the idea, gently and without ever saying it outright, that maybe I'd always resented Brooke's talent and was using this crisis to finally take something from her. Denise called me directly on a Wednesday night, her voice careful in the way people get when they've been sent to do a job they're not fully comfortable with. "I just want to understand your side," she said, which was a generous way of saying Brooke had already told her a side and wanted mine to sound worse by comparison. I walked her through the timeline, the porch, the winter coats, the missed vaccinations, and I could hear her go quiet on the other end, the particular quiet of someone realizing they'd been recruited into a story that didn't hold up once you asked it a single direct question. Denise didn't call again to advocate for Brooke after that. She did show up at the courthouse the day of the hearing, and I noticed her sitting a row behind Carol, which told me everything about which version of events had finally won out in that family's memory. Regina, in the middle of building the abandonment case, put in a request for Brooke's financial and email records as part of discovery, standard procedure for a custody matter with these particular facts. Brooke's own attorney fought it for 2 weeks before a judge ordered partial compliance. Nobody expected what those records were going to show. At the time, it just felt like paperwork, one more slow-moving piece of a case that already felt airtight. I didn't know yet that somewhere in Brooke's email account was a document that would turn the whole story from a mother who'd made an unforgivable, impulsive mistake into something considerably colder. While that discovery process ground forward, Brooke tried a different angle. She called our mother. Carol phoned me on a Sunday night, her voice tight in the specific way it got whenever she was about to ask me to do something she already suspected I'd say no to. "Brooke says you and Gavin are trying to erase her as a mother," she said. "She says you're punishing her for having dreams. Mom, she left 2 toddlers on my porch and told me she'd be back when Nora turns 18. She says that was a joke that got taken out of context. Finn was 6 months behind on his shots. Nora had a cavity nobody caught for months. Does that sound like a joke to you?" Carol didn't have an answer for that, not right away, and I understood in that silence how much work Brooke had already put into managing our mother's version of events before I'd even had a chance to tell mine. Carol had spent 30 years absorbing whatever version of reality Brooke needed her to hold, and old habits like that don't break just because the facts finally show up. She asked me to at least talk to Brooke directly, to hear her out, and I told her I would, once, and that after that I wasn't going to keep having the same conversation on a loop designed to wear me down until I gave in the way I always had before. I called Brooke that Tuesday. She answered, sounding wounded before I'd said a word. "I can't believe you're doing this to me," she said. "I'm your sister. You're also their mother, Brooke. That's the part you keep skipping. I needed a break. Every parent needs a break. You're acting like I abandoned them in a dumpster. You told me you'd be back in 18 years. You packed winter coats for a July trip. That's not a break. That's a plan." She went quiet at that. Quiet in a way I'd remember later, once I understood what she'd actually been planning and why the word landed the way it did. At the time, I read it as guilt. I'd find out soon enough it was something closer to being caught early. "You've never understood what it's like to need something bigger than this town can give you," she said finally. "You got the safe job and the safe house, and you think everyone else should want that too. I think your kids deserve dinner and a dentist appointment, Brooke. That's not a big ask." She hung up on me. It was the last real conversation we had before the hearing, and I spent the rest of that week half expecting her to show up unannounced somewhere at my house, at Harold and Diane's, and demand the kids back on the spot. She never did. I'd later understand that showing up in person had stopped being part of her plan a long time before that phone call ever happened. Regina called Gavin on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the porch, and asked him to come into her office instead of talking over the phone. She asked me to be there too, since I was named on some of the same threads. I remember sitting in a small conference room with a view of the Scioto River, watching Regina lay out a folder like she was setting the table for a meal none of us were going to enjoy. Brooke's email records had come back. Buried in them was a signed contract, dated May 2nd, 3 weeks before she ever rang my doorbell. It was a 6-month residency agreement with a venue in Austin, Texas, called the Cactus Room, for Neon Static to play a rotating house slot 4 nights a week starting in June. The contract included a modest signing bonus, $1,500, and a weekly guaranteed rate of $400. Attached to the same email thread was a message from Brooke to her landlord in Newark, sent May 6th, giving formal notice that she'd be vacating her apartment effective June 1st, citing a job relocation. She had signed a contract, given notice on her lease, and started planning a move to another state, all before she ever said a word to Gavin, to me, or to anyone else who might have asked an inconvenient question about her children. The detail that undid me wasn't the contract. It was a text, sent to a bandmate named Wes 2 days after she signed it, that Regina had pulled from a separate thread. Brooke had written that she'd finally figured out how to make the kid thing work without it following her to Austin, that her brother had a big empty house and more guilt than sense, and that once it was handled she wouldn't have to think about any of it again. Wes had replied with a single word, "Damn." I sat with that for a long time before I could say anything out loud. The porch hadn't been an overwhelmed woman breaking under pressure she never asked for. It had been the last step in a plan she'd been building for at least 3 weeks, maybe longer. The line about turning 18 wasn't dark humor born out of a bad moment. It was close to literal. She had looked at a timeline that stretched out for over a decade and decided that timeline was simply not her problem. The same way rent she'd borrowed and never paid back had stopped being her problem the moment she walked away from it. I thought about the suitcases again. The winter coats packed for a July trip, the immunization folder zipped carefully into the side pocket like someone who knew exactly how long this arrangement was meant to last. I'd noticed all of it that first night and filed it away as strange, a detail that didn't fit the panic of the moment. It fit perfectly once I understood there had been no panic at all. There had only been logistics. Gavin didn't say much in that conference room. He read the contract twice, read the text to Wes 3 times, and then folded his hands on the table and stared at them for a while. She had a job lined up, he finally said, and she picked leaving over telling me the truth. Regina told us the discovery changed the shape of the case entirely. What had started as a custody modification built on a single reckless act now looked, in the language she used, like premeditated abandonment, the kind of case that supports terminating parental rights outright rather than just restricting or supervising them. She filed the motion the following week. The same week, Brooke sent Gavin a text asking if he could front her $200 for studio time. No mention of the kids at all, not one word, as if the entire custody fight happening around her was background noise to a life she still expected to keep living exactly as planned. Regina read that text out loud to us over the phone and called it flatly the most damning single line in the whole file. I drove home that night and sat in my driveway for a long time before going inside, the way you do when you need a few extra minutes before you're expected to be a functioning person again. I kept thinking about the version of the story I'd been telling myself for 3 weeks, the one where my sister had cracked under pressure nobody warned her was coming, where somewhere underneath the mess there was still a woman who loved her kids and had simply lost her footing. That version was easier to carry. It let me be angry at her without having to also grieve her, because you can be furious at someone who slipped and still believe they'll find their way back to solid ground. The contract took that version away from me. There was no slipping in a signed lease notice, and a 6-month gig contract dated 3 weeks before the porch. There was only a woman who had made a decision, quietly and methodically, and then executed it with the same casual confidence she used for everything else she'd ever walked away from. The hearing to terminate her parental rights was set for 2 weeks out. I remember hanging up with Regina and sitting with the particular specific grief of realizing the sister I'd spent 30 years making excuses for had never actually needed the excuses. She'd needed someone to stop making them. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The termination hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a Franklin County family courtroom in front of Judge Alan Kowalski, a man in his 60s with the kind of unhurried patience that made it clear he'd sat through 1,000 versions of every excuse a parent could offer. Brooke walked in wearing a blazer that still had the fold creases from being pulled out of a bag that morning, her hair done, her makeup careful, dressed like a woman auditioning for a part rather than living the life the part was based on. Her new attorney, a younger man named Preston Ilg, opened by describing her as overwhelmed but earnest, a mother who had made a serious mistake and was ready to be the parent she should have been all along. Regina laid out the timeline without much drama, because the facts didn't need any. The porch, the 11 days in Nashville 18 months earlier, the overdue vaccinations and the untreated cavity, the missed and mishandled supervised visits, and then, last, the Austin contract, the lease notice, the text to Wes about the kid thing being handled. She read that text into the record word for word, and I watched 2 of Brooke's own relatives in the gallery, an aunt and a cousin who'd shown up in her support, visibly flinch. Preston tried to recover, arguing that intent didn't erase the possibility of growth, that Brooke had completed 1 parenting class already and was prepared to complete the rest, that she'd secured a part-time job and was building stability. Regina, when it was her turn again, simply asked whether 1 out of 12 classes and a job Brooke had already been written up twice for tardiness had constituted the kind of stability the court should be relying on for 2 small children's futures. Preston didn't have a clean answer. I looked back once before the judge spoke again and found Carol 2 rows behind me, sitting very straight, her hands folded in her lap the way she used to sit in church. She wasn't looking at Brooke the way she had looked at her for 30 years, with that automatic, reflexive defense already loaded and ready. She was just watching, the same way the rest of us were, like a woman finally reading a document she should have read a long time ago instead of trusting the summary someone else had always given her. Then Judge Kowalski took off his glasses, set them on the bench, and looked directly at Brooke for the first time since the hearing had started. "Ms. Halbrook," he said, using her maiden name, the one still on the court filings. "I have one question, and I'd like you to answer it yourself, not through counsel." Brooke straightened up like she'd been called on in school and had an answer ready. "What is your daughter's favorite food?" The courtroom went quiet in a way I don't think I'd ever experienced before, a silence with weight to it, everyone waiting on the same small, simple, devastating thing. Brooke opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Preston like he might have the answer written somewhere in his notes. He didn't. She looked back at the judge. "She likes a lot of things," Brooke said. "She's not picky." "That's not what I asked," Judge Kowalski said. "I asked what her favorite food is." Nothing. 10 full seconds of nothing, which in a quiet courtroom feels like an hour. I watched my sister, a woman who could tell you the exact chord progression of a song she'd written 6 years ago, who could describe in detail the acoustics of a bar she'd played once in Athens, Ohio, fail to produce a single answer about the small human being she'd carried for 9 months and left on my porch in July. "I don't know," she finally said quietly, and something in her voice cracked for the first time all morning. Not performance this time, something closer to the real thing showing through underneath it. Judge Kowalski nodded slowly, like he'd expected exactly that answer, and had asked the question anyway because some things need to be heard out loud in a courtroom before a ruling can mean anything to the people sitting in it. "I'm not asking to embarrass you, Ms. Halbrook," he said. "I'm asking because this court has to decide whether you know your daughter well enough to be trusted with raising her, and I think you just answered that question more clearly than any exhibit in this file could." Preston started to object, something about the question being unfair, and the judge cut him off without raising his voice at all. "Counsel, I gave your client every opportunity to answer. She had it. The record will reflect what she said." I want to be honest about the 90 seconds after that in the room. Nobody spoke. Brooke stood at the table, hands flat against it like she needed the surface to stay upright, and I watched something happen in her face that I'd never seen before. Not anger, not the practiced hurt she usually reached for, but something closer to a person realizing, in real time in front of witnesses, that a version of herself she'd been managing very carefully for years had just come apart in a single unscripted moment. I want to be honest and say I didn't feel triumphant in that moment. I felt something heavier than that, something closer to watching a building you grew up in finally collapse after years of everyone insisting the cracks in the foundation were just cosmetic. Diane, sitting next to me, reached over and took my hand, and I realized I'd been gripping the edge of the bench hard enough to leave marks. Judge Kowalski didn't wait long after that. He ruled from the bench rather than taking it under advisement, citing the pattern of documented abandonment, the premeditation shown in the Austin contract and lease notice, the missed medical care, and Brooke's own inability in that room to answer a basic question about her daughter's life. He terminated her parental rights in full, granting Gavin sole legal and physical custody, with no visitation pending any future petition Brooke might bring years down the line, one that would require her to demonstrate, with evidence, a sustained and meaningful change. I found Brooke in the hallway afterward near the elevators, Preston already gathering his things a few feet away, giving us a wide, uncomfortable berth. She looked smaller out there than she had in the courtroom, the blazer suddenly looking like exactly what it was, a costume she'd have to return. "You did this," she said. "You could have just helped me." "I did help you, Brooke, for 10 years. This is what happens when the person you keep helping never has to face what they've done. They're my kids. They were your kids," I said. "You had a contract in Austin before you ever knocked on my door. You didn't lose them. You gave them away, and you tried to make it look like something happened to you instead of something you did. I need you to hear that, because I don't think anyone said it to you plainly before, and somebody should have a long time ago." She didn't have anything to say back to that. For the first time in my entire life, my sister was completely out of words, and the silence that followed felt less like a victory and more like the sound of something ending that had probably needed to end for a very long time. Word about the hearing moved through the family faster than I expected. Carol called me that same evening, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I heard something in her voice that wasn't defense of Brooke. It was closer to grief, an old woman finally letting herself see a daughter clearly after years of choosing not to. "I keep thinking about all the times I covered for her," Carol said. "The Nashville trip, the money. I told myself I was being a good mother by not making her feel judged. I think I was just teaching her nobody was ever going to stop her. I didn't have much comfort to offer. I told her it wasn't too late to be honest about it now, and that honesty, even 10 years late, still counted for something. Our father, Dennis, was the surprise in all of this. He'd been mostly a ghost in our lives since the divorce, a man who sent birthday cards a week late and called maybe 3 times a year. He texted me the week after the hearing, out of nowhere, a long message saying he'd heard what happened from Carol and that he wanted to help however he could, that he'd take the kids for a weekend if it would give Gavin a break, that he had money set aside he'd never known what to do with, and would rather it go toward Nora's and Finn's future than sit in an account. I hadn't expected an ally out of him. I'd spent years writing him off the same easy way Brooke had trained all of us to write off inconvenient people, and I had to sit with the discomfort of realizing I'd been wrong about at least one person's capacity to show up. Brooke, for her part, did not go quietly. She tried the Austin move anyway, packing up what was left of her Newark apartment and driving down that August, 3 weeks late for the residency she'd signed in May. The Cactus Room had already replaced Neon Static's slot with another band by the time she got there. Unwilling to hold a house gig for a group that had gone dark on communication for over a month during a custody crisis nobody at the venue knew anything about. Wes, the bandmate from the text Regina had read into the record, quit the group 2 weeks after arriving, telling a mutual friend he didn't want his name near what he now understood Brooke had actually done. She resurfaced in Ohio less than 2 months later, broke and staying on a friend's couch in Columbus, and made one attempt to see the kids that didn't go through any legal channel. She showed up outside Harold and Diane's house on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in her car at the curb for nearly 20 minutes before Diane noticed and called Gavin. Gavin called the police preemptively rather than reactively this time, and by the time an officer arrived, Brooke had already left, but the incident was enough for Regina to file for a formal no-contact order as a companion to the termination ruling peeling. One more layer, making sure this couldn't repeat itself in some quieter, less official way. Thanksgiving came 4 months after the ruling, and it was the first holiday any of us had spent without Brooke's name coming up as something to plan around. Diane hosted. The whole extended group crowded into her dining room, Harold at the head of the table carving a turkey he'd clearly researched for weeks, Nora insisting on a specific seat next to me that she called my spot, like it had always belonged to her. Carol came too, and so did Dennis, the first time our parents had been in the same room together in over a decade, and I watched them manage a stiff but genuine civility across the table, both of them finding something to say to Nora about her drawings, both of them quietly proud in their own separated way, of a granddaughter who was starting to look like a kid instead of a kid holding her breath. Somebody, I think it was Denise, raised a glass at one point and said, without naming her directly, that she was grateful this family had finally learned the difference between loyalty and enabling. Nobody needed her to say more than that. Everyone at that table understood exactly which decade she was talking about. The financial side of things kept unwinding slowly through the winter. The wage garnishment against Brooke's income averaged out to less than $60 a month once her sporadic part-time work was accounted for, a number Regina told us not to expect much from, more a formal acknowledgement of the debt than a real repayment plan. Gavin didn't push for more. He told me once, over coffee that December, that he'd stopped needing the money to mean anything. He just needed the court record to exist, so that if Brooke ever tried to rewrite this story to Nora or Finn years down the line, there would be a filed, dated, undeniable account of what had actually happened, immune to whatever softer version she might eventually try to tell. Regina also helped Gavin formalize Harold and Diane as backup emergency guardians in case anything ever happened to him. A piece of paperwork none of us liked thinking about, but all of us agreed was overdue, given how close the kids had already come to being nobody's clear responsibility at all. Around the same time, Brooke tried a quieter route, reaching out to Priya, the old roommate who'd first messaged me about the unpaid rent, asking her to pass along a request for recent pictures of the kids, something Priya could forward without it technically counting as Brooke contacting them directly. Priya called me before responding, unsure what the right thing to do was, and read me the message word for word. Buried in it, almost as an aside, Brooke had referred to Finn as the baby, present tense, months after his second birthday, and asked whether Nora was still doing the preschool thing, a question that assumed a version of Nora's life that had already changed twice over since Brooke last had any real information about it. I told Priya not to send anything, not out of spite, but because a photo handed over through a back channel wasn't going to satisfy whatever Brooke thought she was owed, and it would only give her a foothold to ask for more, softer, and more frequent each time, the exact pattern she'd used on every person in her life who'd ever let her back in an inch. Priya agreed and told Brooke gently that she didn't feel comfortable being in the middle of it. Brooke never asked her again. Brooke tried reaching me directly a handful of times over the following months, and the messages followed a pattern I recognized instantly because I'd been receiving some version of it for a decade. First came the guilt. You destroyed our family over one bad week. Then came the softer angle. I just want to talk, Marcus. You're still my brother. Then, when neither worked, came the ask, the same shape it always took, dressed in new language. I'm in a rough spot. Could you send something to help me get back on my feet? I'll pay you back once things stabilize. I didn't answer any of them, not out of cruelty, out of a hard-earned understanding that answering had never once in 10 years led anywhere but back to exactly this. There were quieter costs to all of it too, ones that didn't show up in a courtroom. I found myself, some nights, thinking about the sister who used to sing through our shared bedroom wall when we were kids, the girl who stood at our grandmother's graveside at 12 years old and sang Amazing Grace a cappella because none of the adults in the family could get through it without falling apart, and somebody needed to hold the room together. That girl had real light in her. I don't think that light ever fully went out. I think it just got buried under 3 decades of nobody ever making her sit with a consequence long enough for it to teach her anything, myself included, for most of that time. Mourning that girl felt different from being angry at the woman she'd become. I let myself do both, some nights more of one than the other. There's a specific memory I kept returning to that fall, one I hadn't thought about in years before all of this. I was 16, Brooke was 13, and our father had just moved his last box out of the house in Newark. Brooke found me sitting on the back steps that night, not crying exactly, just staring at the yard the way you do when you don't have a name yet for what you're feeling. She sat down next to me without saying anything, and after a while she started humming something low and then singing it, some song she was working on for a school talent show, quiet enough that it was really only for me. She wasn't trying to fix anything, she just didn't want me to sit out there alone. I think about that version of her more than I want to admit, the one who noticed when someone near her was hurting and moved toward it instead of away, because somewhere between that back step and the porch where she left her own children 10 years later, that instinct got buried under something else, something that only moved toward its own needs and called everything else a distraction. I don't know exactly when the trade happened. I just know I miss the sister who used to sit with me in the dark, and I know that sister isn't coming back, whatever Brooke does with the rest of her life. The logistics stretched out for months after the ruling. Gavin filed to formally update both kids' birth records to reflect direct sole custody, a process that took until October and involved 3 separate trips to the county recorder's office. Regina helped set up a court-monitored child support order against Brooke that she promptly ignored, missing her first 4 payments entirely, which triggered a wage garnishment process against whatever part-time income she could show once she was back in Ohio, income that turned out to be inconsistent enough that the garnishment mostly collected small, sporadic amounts that never came close to covering what the court had calculated she owed. I set up a modest education trust for Nora and Finn that fall, not out of guilt, but because I'd realized somewhere in the middle of that summer that showing up wasn't a single dramatic gesture on a porch. It was going to be a long series of small, unglamorous decisions made over years, and I wanted to start making mine. Nora started seeing a child therapist in Pickerington that September, a woman named Dr. Renee Castle, who specialized in early childhood attachment.
Diane told me after the 3rd session that Nora had drawn a picture of her house, and it wasn't Brooke's old apartment. It was Harold and Diane's kitchen table, all 4 of us, Gavin, Harold, Diane, and me, seated around it with Finn in a high chair. Doctor
Castle said that kind of drawing this early into treatment was a strong sign that Nora's sense of safety was already reorganizing itself around the people who had actually shown up for her, rather than the people whose absence she'd spent years quietly adjusting to. Finn, too young to remember much of it consciously, caught up on his vaccination schedule by winter and stopped losing weight almost immediately once his meals stopped being unpredictable. Diane told me once, over coffee that November, that raising Gavin had never prepared her for something like this, and that some nights she still couldn't quite believe 2 toddlers she'd barely been allowed to see for over a year were suddenly asleep down her hallway every weekend. She and Harold had spent the better part of 2 years being politely, gradually shut out by Brooke, invited to fewer holidays, told the kids were too busy for visits that never got rescheduled, the ordinary erosion that happens when one parent decides the other side of the family is inconvenient. Diane said she used to lie awake wondering if she'd done something wrong, if there was some slight she'd committed without noticing. Watching her now, in the kitchen most Saturdays with flour on her hands and Nora standing on a step stool beside her, I understood that whatever she'd lost in those 2 shutout years, she'd made a decision the moment the door opened again, not to spend the time she'd gotten back wondering about it. She just cooked and taught and showed up over and over, the exact opposite of the pattern that had cost her those years in the first place. I visited most weekends that fall, driving the 40 minutes to Pickerington on Saturdays, sometimes staying through Sunday afternoon. Nora started calling ahead to ask what I was bringing, always some specific, absurdly detailed request, and somewhere in October I realized I finally knew the answer to the question that had ended my sister's parental rights in a Franklin County courtroom. I knew exactly what Nora's favorite food was. It had taken me one dinner to learn it. It had taken Brooke 31 years of being her mother to never ask. It's been a little over a year since the porch now. I want to tell you it ends with some clean, triumphant bow, the kind these stories sometimes promise. But that's not quite true, and I'd rather give you the real ending than the satisfying one. Nora is 5 now, finishing her first year of preschool at a co-op in Pickerington that Diane found for her, the kind of place with a wait list and a garden the kids tend themselves. She's loud in the mornings and quiet at night, and she still occasionally asks whether her mom is coming back, less often than she used to, but often enough that I don't think that question ever fully closes for a kid, no matter how many good years pile up around it. Dr. Castle says that's normal, that the question isn't a wound reopening, it's just a kid doing the ordinary work of understanding her own history at whatever pace she's ready for. Finn is 3, loud in an entirely different register, obsessed with a plastic dump truck he refuses to nap without, caught up on every missed appointment, thriving in the specific, unremarkable way toddlers thrive when nobody's counting the days until someone comes back for them. I know Nora's favorite food now. It's not a complicated answer. It's her grandmother's baked ziti, the recipe Diane makes with too much basil and not quite enough salt, the same dish Nora asks for on her birthday and on ordinary Tuesdays with equal seriousness. It took me one dinner to learn it, back in October, sitting at that table with sauce on my shirt while Nora explained at great length why the noodles had to be the curvy kind or the whole thing didn't count. I think about that a lot. My sister spent 31 years as that girl's mother and never once landed on an answer a judge could hold up as evidence that she'd been paying attention. I spent one Tuesday night at a kitchen table and knew it cold. Love isn't a feeling you carry around and cash in when it's convenient. It's 1,000 small Tuesdays, chosen on purpose, over and over, whether or not anyone's keeping score. Gavin's doing well. He cut back to regular hours at the union not long after the ruling, once the extra shifts stopped being necessary to cover a gap Brooke had left behind. He started seeing someone this spring, an occupational therapist named Renata, who Nora has decided, with the blunt confidence only a 5-year-old can manage, is pretty okay so far. I like her. She asks good questions and doesn't try too hard, which, after everything this family's been through, felt like exactly the right energy to bring into it. Harold and Diane still have the kids most weekends when Gavin's working, and I'm out there often enough now that Diane keeps a coffee mug in her cabinet she just calls almost mine. Brooke is in Columbus, as far as I know, though I've stopped being the person who tracks her movements closely. The band never recovered from the Austin fallout. I heard through Priya, of all people, that Neon Static quietly dissolved that winter. Wes moving on to a different project, the others scattering the way bands do once the center of gravity that held them together stops being reliable. Brooke works on and off at a coffee shop near German Village, and from what little filters back to me, she's told at least a few people there a version of this story where she was the one wronged, where an overprotective, controlling brother and a bitter ex-husband conspired to take her children from her during a rough patch she was already climbing out of. I don't correct that version when it reaches me secondhand. I've learned there's no version of the truth persuasive enough to compete with the one a person builds specifically so they don't have to sit with what they actually did. Ohio law gave her the option, a year after the ruling, to petition for the case to be reviewed, provided she could show sustained, documented change, steady work, completed parenting classes, some real evidence that the woman in that courtroom wasn't the whole of who she still was. Regina told us in the spring that Brooke's attorney had inquired about the process. Nothing was ever filed. As far as I know, nothing ever will be. I think part of Brooke understood, somewhere underneath everything else, that she couldn't survive a second version of that question about the baked ziti, not with a year of silence sitting behind her instead of just a bad summer. I still think about the girl who sang through our shared wall growing up, the one who stood at our grandmother's gravesite at 12 and held an entire grieving room together with her voice because none of the adults could manage it. I don't think that girl was a lie. I think she was real, and I think somewhere along the way, she learned that being extraordinary got her more attention than being reliable ever did, and she built a whole life on that trade without ever noticing what it was costing the people closest to her. I grieve her sometimes, genuinely, on nights when Nora asks about her mother, and I have to watch a 5-year-old do more emotional labor around this than the adult who caused it ever has. That grief hasn't gone away, and I don't think it's supposed to. Losing a sister to her own choices is still a loss, even when the choice she made was the wrong one, even when everyone agrees the outcome protected the people who needed protecting most. What I keep coming back to, a year out from that porch, is the difference between an accident and a decision. For a while, I told this story to myself as an accident, a woman who cracked under pressure and did something unforgivable in a moment she couldn't take back. That version let me be angry without having to fully let go of her. The Austin contract took that comfort away from me, and I'm grateful for it now, even though it didn't feel like a gift at the time. It let me stop waiting for a version of my sister who was never coming back, because the truth is, she was never planning to. She'd already signed the paperwork on a different life before she ever knocked on my door. Brooke wanted me to know, on that porch, that she wouldn't be back until Nora turned 18. I think about that line more than almost anything else from that whole summer. She meant it as a countdown, something distant and safely theoretical, a joke with an expiration date so far off it barely felt real. Nora will turn 18 one day, and when she does, I don't think she'll be standing on a porch waiting for a mother who finally decided to show up on schedule. She'll already know exactly who spent those years choosing her, every single ordinary Tuesday of them, and exactly who never did. That's the consequence Brooke actually earned. Not a courtroom, not a headline, not a hard conversation in a hallway near the elevators. Just a daughter who is going to grow up knowing precisely where she stood and precisely who stood there with her. I didn't get to be a father the way I once imagined I might, later, on my own schedule, with someone I chose and a plan I'd built for it. I became one on a Tuesday evening in July, with no warning at all, because 2 suitcases showed up on my porch, and somebody had to be the person who opened the door and meant it when they said they'd stay. Some nights I still miss the sister I used to have, or the one I convinced myself I had. Most nights now, I'm just grateful I was home when the doorbell rang.